grant liaison at Cooperative Institute SIMS at NSSL, University of Oklahoma. And the topic today is the CI Flow Project, Coastal and Inland Flooding Observation and Warning. I remind everyone of format for the VLab forum is we have about approximately 30 minutes of presentation followed by a question and answer period of about 30 minutes. We ask folks to sort of hold off their questions until the question and answer unless it's a clarifying question. To ask a question, please use the raise your hand feature or provide your question through the chat. John Chattel will be handling those questions. We're hoping with these presentations to share information on R&D projects which are working their way through the pipeline and through development that eventually may be applied to weather service operations in particular. And the hope is to inform folks early on about what's coming so that we can prepare as an agency to better facilitate these transitions and so that they sort of hit the ground running when they hit operation. I'll remind everyone as well that the session is being recorded using the GoToMeeting feature and will be uploaded to the VLab forum website shortly after the presentation is concluded. So without further ado, I'll hand over the control and the mic, so to speak, to Cody. You there, Cody?
I am.
Very good. Go right ahead.
Okay, thank you. I want to start by giving a little bit of background on the CI Flow project. CI Flow was initiated in response to Hurricanes Dennis and Floyd, which happened in September of 1999. Antecedent rainfall from Hurricane Dennis essentially saturated the soils in coastal North Carolina. And then when Floyd made landfall a few weeks later, it resulted in a lot of runoff because the soils were already saturated, essentially causing widespread flooding and flash flooding. And then in addition to all of the rainfall-induced flooding, there was storm surge that was moving up the rivers, primarily the Tarr-Pamlico and Neuse River basins. And so those are the basins of interest for this research project. Shortly after Hurricanes Dennis and Floyd, the director of NOAA's OAR issued a challenge to form a strategic and sustainable relationship between OAR research labs and the Sea Grant Extension Network. And so the National Severe Storms Laboratory, being a landlocked lab, was chosen to try to increase collaboration. And so NSSL partnered with primarily North Carolina Sea Grant on this project. And so the initial project that spun out of that February 2000 meeting was called Inland Flood Warning Project, or iFlow, and the focus was to force a hydrologic model developed at the University of Oklahoma with NSSL rainfall estimates. In 2001, North Carolina State University joined the iFlow project, in particular Len Petrofeza, and the goal was to couple the OU hydrologic model with North Carolina State University's coastal and estuary model. In 2006, I guess there were some naming conflicts, so iFlow became CI Flow. Plus, with the inclusion of North Carolina State, it picked up more of a coastal aspect, and that is around the same time that the National Sea Grant Office established a Sea Grant liaison at SIMS NSSL. In 2007, some ASTRC researchers at the University of Oklahoma and the University of North Carolina approached the National Severe Storms Laboratory about an IUCE proposal that they were putting together, and that essentially resulted in the joining of ASTRC to the CI Flow project and extending their hydrodynamic model grid up the Tarr and Neuse rivers. In 2009, project researchers conducted a test case of Hurricane Isabel in a high-and-cast mode of the coupled system. In 2010, Hurricane Earl was the first first real-time test. It was sort of a storm that glanced the Outer Banks of North Carolina, so it wasn't very impactful. But then in 2011, Hurricane Irene was the first robust test of the real-time system. In the current state of National Weather Service operations, the Tar-Pamlico Basin has only one routine forecast point, which is the red dot in its basin, and the Neuse Basin has 3 routine forecast points and only 2 flood-only forecast points. All of the forecast points, whether they are routine or flood-only, are upstream of the coastal drainage areas. And in fact, if you look at the Atlantic and Gulf Coast as a whole, 95% of the Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico coastal drainage areas do not receive any routine hydrologic information. And so this absence of routine water level information within coastal watersheds where populations are continuing to grow is the primary motivation for CI flow. The 2 National Weather Service forecast offices that have worked with us on this project are Newport News City and Raleigh. And so with their help, we put together sort of a map of CI flow forecast points. A lot of their input was based off of requests that they get for water level information during nor'easters and tropical events. This is just a schematic that illustrates the structure of both the real-time and hindcast modes of the CI flow system. As a whole, this system loosely couples atmospheric, hydrologic, and hydrodynamic models to produce a total water level forecast. I will touch on the precipitation, hydrologic model, and hydrodynamic models separately in the following slides. But overall, the system attempts to capture complex interactions between rainfall, river flows, waves, tides, and storm surge. For past rainfall, CI flow uses the National Severe Storm Lab's next generation QPE, which is currently the newest version, is Q3. This combines best practices of OHD's multi-sensor QPE and NSSL's multi-radar multi-sensor system, or MRMS. In particular, CI flow uses the gauge-adjusted 1-hour rainfall accumulation. And then for future rainfall, CI flow uses the Weather Prediction Center QPS, which is a 6-hour accumulation. I would like to point out that only day 1 and day 2 QPS are used. The rainfall beyond day 2 is not currently accounted for. This decision was made after lengthy discussions with Southeast River Forecast Center and the 2 weather forecast offices that are active in the project in terms of rainfall uncertainty and whether or not it was beneficial to include day 3 and beyond. CI flow, as I mentioned earlier, focuses on the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse River basins of North Carolina, which were most impacted during Hurricane Floyd. The entire basin, or the entirety of both basins are modeled with the hydrologic model, but output at and upstream of 4 handoff points that is what is utilized. The 4 handoff points represent the locations where discharge information from the hydrologic model is passed on to the hydrodynamic model. The 4 handoff points, there are 2 on the main stems of each river. The Tar River handoff point is near Tarboro. The Neuse River handoff point is near Kinston. And then there are also handoff points on a tributary of each river, so Fishing Creek and Contentnia Creek on the Tar and Neuse respectively. The hydrologic model used with CI flow is the National Weather Service Hydrology Laboratory Research Distributed Hydrologic Model, which is a hybrid conceptual physical distributed watershed model. Surface runoff generation is based on the Sacramento Soil Moisture Accounting Model, or SAC-SMA, and water is routed downstream using a kinematic wave equation. Our RDHM is run on a 4-kilometer HVAC grid, and it runs every 6 hours. When it's run every 6 hours, there's a 2-day hindcast or spin-up time, and then a 5-day forecast. So of the 5-day forecast, there's only 2 days of QPF actually going into that, and then the QPE comes from NSSL's Q3. HLRDHM has 19 parameters and 6 state variables that control the storages and fluxes in the model. And while that allows a lot of flexibility to apply the model to geographically diverse settings, it also introduces uncertainty. We were fortunate to have some available computational resources here in Norman, Oklahoma, and so the CI-Flow researchers developed a 128-member riverine ensemble for the CI-Flow real-time system. And what this does is it combines 4 different parameter sets, one which is event-based off of Hurricane Isabel, an automatic parameter set, a multiple basin scale parameter set, and then the a priori uncalibrated parameter set. It also includes 16 rainfall multipliers that are uniformly distributed between 0.8 and 1.2, as well as 16 channel routing perturbations. So when all of these combinations are combined, we end up with 128 ensemble members. And then the ensemble mean at each of those 4 handoff points is what is then passed on to the hydrodynamic model. The hydrodynamic model that CI-Flow uses is the 2-dimensional AdCirc, or advanced circulation, and that is tightly coupled with the simulating waves near shore model, or SWAN. AdCirc uses river input or a unit flux boundary condition at the 4 handoff points that were mentioned previously, and the location of these handoff points was based off of historical storm surge. So it's sort of the highest anticipated surge, and that was based off Hurricane Floyd, and it's at an elevation of 8 meters. And AdCirc, coupled with SWAN, account for tide, tidal potential, wind waves, and the wetting and drying elements. We run the CI-Flow system in 2 different modes, what I'll call tropical mode and non-tropical. If the National Hurricane Center is issuing advisories, then an asymmetric vortex wind model uses the official track, forward speed, radius to maximum wind, central pressure, and other information that's included in the hurricane advisories to derive a wind field. If there's not an active tropical system, for example, a nor'easter, then the NAM model winds are what are used for the wind boundary, the wind forcing for AdCirc. Both AdCirc and SWAN are run on the same unstructured finite element grid, and it extends up the Atlantic coast. There's higher resolution in the Tar, Pamlico, and Neuse rivers, the Outer Banks, and the Pamlico Sound, and that goes down to a resolution of 30 to 60 meters. And again, this runs every 6 hours, just like the riverine ensemble does, but it produces a single deterministic forecast. Within AdCirc, there are approximately 300,000 compute nodes. So when we're in tropical mode, a 5-day forecast is run. That takes about an hour and a half at 192 processors. And the 3.5-day forecast, when using the NAM model for wind forcing, it takes 1.25 hours on 372 processors. So the computational expense of AdCirc is, and coupled with SWAN, is what ultimately limits us to a single deterministic forecast. There are 2 different avenues to access CI-Flow information, and those are tied to essentially the source of funding. Since CI-Flow is a research project, NSSL maintains a password-protected website that requires a NOAA LDAP login or official CI-Flow partner login. The password protection keeps it out of, it prevents any sort of confusion with official NOAA forecasts. This site was designed a couple years ago. So it was originally designed to mimic the old AHIP interface, where the inundation map, it was before the inundation maps were switched to a Google Maps display. But it did add a functionality of that as you scroll across the hydrograph on the left-hand side of the screen, the inundation map would change automatically based off of the predicted hydrograph. And also, this is also the only way to access the full, I guess, any of the riverine ensemble outputs. And you can also access this page not only just through the secure SSL page, but there is a link to it from the NOAA Coast CI Flow portal. The DHS Center of Excellence program funds nearly all of the AdCirc-related research applied to CI Flow through the Coastal Hazard Center at the University of North Carolina. So through that center's partnership with Louisiana State University, a coastal emergency risk assessment web interface was developed, and this displays the spatial and time series data from AdCirc in real time. The CIRA website, in terms of generating the output, is part of the AdCirc Surge Guidance System, and under that funding line, it's required that it be publicly available. So that website is not password protected. As I mentioned earlier, Hurricane Isabel was the first hindcast test case that we looked at. So a little bit of background on Hurricane Isabel. It peaked as a Category 5 hurricane. It was a Category 2 at landfall near Drum Inlet, North Carolina on September 18, 2003. It produced 4 to 7 inches of rainfall in eastern North Carolina and storm surge of 6 to 10 feet within the western parts of the Pamlico Sound, and was responsible for 16 deaths in the United States. These figures illustrate these are some of the AdCirc results for the coastal locations and even further out in the ocean for AdCirc. The top row of figures, those are water elevations, and then the bottom are wave heights compared to field data. What stands out most is that pre-storm wave heights were underrepresented because of the spin-up phase of Swan. But overall, the water elevations closer to shore were handled very well by AdCirc. And then looking at some of the USGS locations along rivers, the Couple system overpredicted discharge and water levels during the low flow before the event, and then also after it was more pronounced in the discharge and water surface elevation. But this was likely due in part to the poor resolution of the riverbed and the manner in which AdCirc handled the wetting and drying of nearby elements to the river. At Pamlico River at Washington, in the bottom panel, this large negative spike is when surge moves up the river, and that was both captured quite well, both in discharge and water surface elevation, both in magnitude and timing. As I mentioned, Hurricane Irene was the first opportunity for us to test the real-time CI flow system, where as opposed to using winds that were put together post-event, this was using the real-time system based off of the National Hurricane Center best track. Some background on Hurricane Irene: it peaked as a Category 3 hurricane. It was a Category 1 at landfall near Cape Lookout, North Carolina on the 27th of August, 2011. 15.74 inches of rainfall were recorded in Mayberry, North Carolina, and there was a storm surge of 8 to 11 feet within portions of the Pamlico Sound. There were 41 deaths associated with Hurricane Irene in the United States, and 21 were due to rainfall-induced floods. Okay, and so a little bit of explanation information behind this graphic. This is the riverine ensemble from HLRDHM. The black solid line are the USGS observations for Tar River, Tarboro. The blue sort of dashed line is the ensemble mean, and then when we were trying to experiment in terms of what single line to show on the CI flow, on the NSL password protected CI flow page, we had toyed around with the concept of trying to pick what we call a best member. What we ended up doing was comparing the previous 24 hours of each ensemble member to the USGS observations, and then based on that comparison, a best member is chosen. So in sort of the AHIP type hydrograph, that is the single line that's displayed above the full ensemble member spread. And so this just shows differences in the ensemble, the best member, and the mean as the event evolved. So in the upper left-hand corner, the event is entirely QPF-based. So there aren't a lot of similarities between the observations and that best member. But if you jump down to the bottom row, as the event becomes more QPE-based as opposed to QPF, that best member becomes a bit more meaningful. But overall, this does reinforce the decision to use that ensemble mean as a method or in terms of passing information on to AdCert, as opposed to trying to pick an arbitrary best member. And then looking at peak water level errors at Tar River, Tarboro, the errors are approximately 20% when precipitation was QPF only. But those dropped to less than 10% when dominated by QPE. Looking at some of the AdCert results from Hurricane Irene, the different colors represent different National Hurricane Center advisories. So brown is advisory 28, blue is advisory 25, red is advisory 23, and then black is the best track post-event. So the top image is from Washington, and the bottom one is from New Bern. So you can see that the earlier the advisory number, the larger the shift in terms of peak water height, as well as shifts in timing. A lot of that had to do with track errors and the forecast intensity, the forecasted intensity of Irene from the National Hurricane Center advisory. Essentially a more westerly track resulted in a later peak of water levels compared to the observations. Model resolution in the rivers may be limiting the ability to capture the timing and magnitude of those peaks. Looking at more coastal locations, we have Oregon Inlet in the top panel and Beaufort, North Carolina in the bottom panel. Similar to the riverine, but not quite as large of a difference, but the track error and the forecasted track and intensity had significant impact on the performance of AdCert relative to the observation. And this map shows differences in high water marks and the peak water levels predicted by AdCert. Overall, 81% of the high water marks were within plus or minus 0.5 meters of the AdCert prediction, 16% within plus or minus 1 meter, and 3% within 1.5 meters. The largest differences between the high water marks and the AdCert prediction occurred in small inlets. The best way to decrease that error would be to increase the resolution in those inlets of the AdCert grid, which ultimately adds to the compute time necessary to run the AdCert. So it's very much a trade-off. Some of the current research that's going on with the CI-FLOW project now that the system is sort of up and running in real time year-round is HEC-RAS coupling. Because of the compute time necessary to run ASCIRC in real time, to try to work towards being able to run an ensemble, we have to be able to reduce the ASCIRC runtime. So a method of trying to cut down that runtime would be to lessen the number of compute nodes with an ASCIRC. So we have a student that is looking at inserting HEC-RAS for fine-featured 1D flow area, where he's looking in particular at the Tar River between Washington and Tarboro, looking at two different versions of HEC-RAS cross-sections. One is simply the main stem of the Tar River, and then the other includes 4 tributaries. The ongoing challenges with this, it requires ASCIRC grid modification in order to really assess how much compute time is being saved by getting rid of that Washington to Tarboro stretch, and then to ideally define handoff points where, by inserting something like HEC-RAS, you lose wind forcing. So sort of trying to find that ideal handoff point while, perhaps gaining area that rainfall is being accounted for, but then losing area where winds are being taken into account for two-dimensional flow. The current status of this project is doing idealized HEC-RAS runs with synthetic boundary conditions. And so just an example is this image up here where green is the most upstream point, and then black is the furthest downstream. So differences between the black and the blue lines primarily have to do with distance from the synthetic tide boundary condition, and also the influence of the tributaries that are between those two cross-sections. And so just to kind of look at a map, it was 3 lines. One was here at Washington, one was up by Greenville, and then one was in between. This shows the cross-sections of just the main stem HEC-RAS implementation that we'll be working on. But there, as I mentioned, there is a second that has cross-sections for 4 tributaries, which are marked by the arrows. Another ongoing project right now is what we're calling CI-FLOW South. The Department of Homeland Security provided additional funding for the Coastal Hazard Center to look at duplicating the coupled model system in a basin with different characteristics. And so the Pearl River Basin along the Mississippi-Louisiana border was chosen. And the current status of that project is that HRDHM has been calibrated, and the Hurricane Isaac test case will be run by July 2014. So we're looking forward to seeing those results. Other ASCIRC relevant research going on at the University of Notre Dame, because ASCIRC doesn't account for rainfall runoff processes over its domain. They are working on incorporating rainfall runoff into the ASCIRC model physics. And then moving more towards the ability to do ensembles with ASCIRC, but yet also using a hydrologic hydrodynamic coupled system. Any kind of variation in track and intensity of the storm would require a complementary variation in rainfall pattern. And so they are working with a synthetic rainfall model to produce precipitation patterns for a hydrologic model to use that's consistent with the track and intensity variations. And then sort of the final sort of coordination with other NOAA storm surge activities is that we are maintaining open communication lines with Riverside and URS, who were awarded the Storm Surge Model Development Project, which is the Sandy Supplemental Project. They're working to build the capacity to couple a storm surge model with river forecasts in our hydraulic models, aiming for a 200 to 500 meter resolution for both the Gulf and Atlantic coast. So we've been having some active discussions on sort of best practices and lessons learned from taking the ASTER grid and developing it to couple with a river model in terms of orientation of elements and the best way to pass information across. So that's sort of the iFlow at its current state. And so with that, I'll take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Cody, very much. This is Steve. Now, I got a couple of clarifying questions. What does HEC-RAS stand for?
It is an Army Corps of Engineer acronym.
Maybe I don't need to know what the acronym means, but what is that piece doing to the?
It's a one-dimensional hydraulic model that can handle two-directional flow. So while essentially the hydrologic model can only handle downstream flow, and so in order to minimize coupling the different models that had to communicate with each other within the iFlow, they extended, at a computational expense, they extended the ASTER grid upstream. So in order to cut down on computational load, we're trying to insert a model that can handle two-directional flow upstream and downstream during significant storm surge.
Okay, thank you. So let me turn to John. Do we have any people who would like to have submitted questions or would like to raise their hand? Not at this point. Okay, so folks, if you would like to ask a question to Cody, please use the raise your hand feature or submit a chat question for John to read to the group. This is Steve. I'm going to follow up now. More of a generalized question, I guess, is, I mean, so over the history of this project, and I believe you haven't been in it from the very beginning, so I don't, yeah, but I mean, has anyone looked at the general question about how, say, Weather Service or NOAA might be using the results of this project to better inform how we provide decision support for communities in, say, North Carolina? I mean, in case of hurricane evacuations, I guess the old school was that, you know, you knew where the hurricane was heading, and hopefully the track was good, and it made landfall, and you try to evacuate, you know, areas near landfall, get people to move inland. Now, is some of your results saying that, well, that's still generally true, but now we want to avoid, you know, certain river areas or et cetera, so that the question on how one evacuates is now more complicated or more nuanced at a minimum?
Jamie Rome with the National Hurricane Center and I have talked about this a bit. Because they're trying to envision how they, you know, like once the Sandy Supplemental Project is completed and they have access to something more like this, those are the type of questions that they're asking. At this point, the way he has envisioned it is that when there's a lot of track uncertainty, they would really have to heavily rely on like P-surge. But then, because in terms of evacuation, those decisions are made at this point, I mean, based on a single track or a single deterministic forecast. Those decisions are made when the track uncertainty is still kind of too great. But Jamie sees applicability to like distribution of resources post landfall for the near future, but it's hard to answer that without just because as of right now there isn't the capability really to even do much more than like a 3-member ensemble if you course in the answer grid.
Okay, thanks. We have a question in the room.
Hi, Cody. This is Mark Vincent. First, this is really pioneering work, ahead of its time, and I think a lot of best practices and lessons learned will benefit NOAA. And having had my house and car flooded in a hurricane flood event before, I know this is a needed type project. Could you go back to one of your first slides that showed the different components of CI flow? Yeah, I think something like that. So I guess the general question I have, and I know CI flow has really been pioneering and ahead of its time, I'm curious if the entire thing is envisioned to transition, or individual components, or best practices and ways to do things will be leveraged into other products. So like I assume that the QPE and QPF, that's operational, and there's improvements on that. So the hydrologic models, are those being run operationally now, and could those be run operationally as an individual element? And then I know there's a lot of AdCirc modeling that's being stood up at INSEP with NOS, and I believe this AdCirc model is run by Rick Ludick now. Is that correct, or where is it?
Let me back it. I'll start with those things pretty quickly. MRMS is being transitioned to operations. So that handles the QPE, and we use an operational QPF product. The HLRDHM is a National Weather Service model, but from the river forecast centers that we have talked to, they don't typically run it. They typically stick with, I believe, just I think just the SAC SMA from what we have learned from the Southeast River Forecast Center and the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center. In terms of the ensemble, the riverine ensemble, the RFCs don't have the computational resources to run that. So sort of how we envision the system, like the hydrologic component, like in my opinion, that would be left up to the RFCs to make the decision of what model they felt was most appropriate for their basins. And then, based on my understanding of the Sandy Supplemental Project that Riverside and URS were awarded, that is AdCirc at a more coarse resolution, it's higher resolution than the current SDOT, but it doesn't include wave modeling. So it's more sort of there are parts of the system that are on their way to operations, some that already are, but are being modified using lessons learned and best practices from the project. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does. And again, this is a lot of great work, and I could envision 5 years down the road, NOAA will have something that looks like this, but it may be CI flow in its entirety, or all the lessons and best practices and similar components. So that'll be interesting the way it turns
out. John, do we have any questions from the audience?
No, we don't.
Okay. I got another follow-up or two as well. So kind of along the lines of where Mark was coming from, in terms of Weather Service interaction on the project, during these events, or I guess it's been a fairly quiet tropical storm-wise recently, but are you working with, does the project work with the Morehead City and the Raleigh office during events to interpret the CI flow output and use it in their decision making and decision support?
They more so provide feedback on post-event because they're so busy during the event. We'll ask for feedback after the fact on whether or not they noticed if there were particular locations where the information wasn't as useful. They're also actually what they seem to use. They have a tendency to want to look at the output more during nor'easters, more so than hurricanes or tropical storms. And I believe that, I think it was someone at the Newport Morehead City Forecast Office also said that offshore, or I guess downriver winds, producing almost like a low flow situation, that it can be helpful then as well. But sort of since it's an experimental product, it's not supposed to be used in the sort of creation of official forecasts. So
okay.
I can't speak in regards to that, but they have been, in terms of where information is needed and the type of information, just from a research perspective, some of the initial graphics that we had put together were in different units. The water levels were in meters instead of feet, and so sometimes it was even something as simple as that they couldn't do an easy comparison with operational products simply because of units. So they provided feedback in a variety of different manners throughout the project.
Okay, because one of the hopes for this type of thing would be to try to begin looking at more specificity in the decision support operations that these offices could provide, because we typically have very generic call to actions. There could be flooding and heavy river flooding, flash flooding, storm surge, winds, etc. And so with the output from this kind of a model, that they would seemingly they could look at specific areas and at least provide emergency managers with maybe additional information on top of those kind of generic warning call to actions.
Right. I know that one of the forecast points that they specifically requested was located near, it was some kind of military base. And apparently a section of it frequently flooded. So, some of their forecast points, like the feedback that we received for forecast points, were very much dependent on specific information that they are asked, but haven't been able to provide detailed responses to.
All right. Hello?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. But yeah, it's been a tricky project to navigate because because a good portion of it is DHS funded. DHS has expectations that those researchers work with emergency managers, whereas or at least some sort of end user that falls under the DHS umbrella, I think, is their requirement for that line of funding. Whereas sort of on the NOAA side, the flow of information should be from the forecaster to the emergency manager and on. There actually is I don't know if anyone is familiar, but there is a first responder education program in the state of North Carolina called NC First. It was modeled after Oklahoma's called OK First. But they do a lot of weather education for first responders, how to use weather information, and they've sort of they've developed a parallel system for North Carolina. That would be a really interesting opportunity to possibly look at how this type of additional information could impact local decision making through that sort of chain of command of information. But it's not something that we have looked at yet. I think that would, in my opinion, that would require some social scientists. And that's something that we're just starting to really spin up within our building. And then there are some probably within North Carolina Sea Grant that would be able to help out with that, since Sea Grant has a history of a lot of social science research.
Okay. Okay. John, any?
Yes. Let's see. Mustafa has a question, and he says he remembers you mentioned components are loosely coupled, but he wants to know, does AdCert provide unswan with current, i.e., is wave current interaction considered?
Yeah, AdCert and Swan are a tight coupling. They're run on the same unstructured grid, and they talk back and forth frequently.
Okay.
He says thank you.
He says thank you.
And we also have a question from Peter Aner, I believe it is, and I've unmuted him. So if you would like to ask his question, feel free.
Go ahead, Peter.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. A few years ago, I worked on a project with a couple of the weather forecast offices for Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences and the University of Maryland, and Nobles, which was the Chesapeake Inundation Prediction System project. And I just wondered if you had looked at the results of that project, because the goal was pretty similar, to provide high-resolution total water level forecasts for tropical systems, and it used an ensemble approach. And at that time we were using the LCIRC model and another model that I can't remember. But those results, there should be papers available on that, and very similar goals to this project.
Thanks. Yeah, I actually did attend that the RIC Forum webinar that was presented on the 6th.
Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure you were aware of that work that was done, because there was a lot of interesting results, and we also looked at working with emergency managers on how they might use that information. So there was a social scientist involved in that work. So you know, if you need more information on it, I can pass you on to those people that were working on that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Peter. John, we have a...
That's all for now.
Okay. We still have time, folks, so if you have a question, please send it to John or use the raise your hand. Cody, I mean, in terms of weather service, because that's where I sit, who is your the POC on the weather service side for the overall CI flow project?
I'm I don't know that we have sort of a primary, I mean, in terms of Newport News City, it's Rich Bandy. In terms of Raleigh, it's Darren Pogorski. At the National Hurricane Center, it's Jamie Rome. And then in NOS, it's Jesse Fine. But it's
anybody in the Office of Hydrologic Development?
Hassan Mashriqi.
Who? Oh,
Hassan
okay.
Mashriqi.
He's here. He's here in the room. Okay. I've never met him, so okay, he's here. That answers that question. Do you have any comments?
Since I'm on the spot, it's a very nice presentation, Cody, and well thought out and all put together. And I would say we are not POC, more like I'm working from Office of Hydrologic Development to build operational model for River Forecast Center, in this case Southeast, and Regina is the HIC there. So this is as great as it is. This is not within the infrastructure of NOAA. So NOAA goes with its own product. So if there is a hurricane storm surge, there is an official channel to give you that information.
Right.
These are all supplementary and need to get basis people within the weather service will ask for it or look for it. So we are working in collaboration mode with CI Flow in the Tar River, and idea is to make Tar River an operational HEC-RAS model. And the HEC-RAS is the model. It's, you asked what it means. It's the Hydraulic Engineering Center, Hydrologic Engineering Center River Analysis System. And that is the model actually in the CHIPS. I'm aware of that. Is the CHIPS is Community Hydrologic Prediction System that Gary Carter, while he was there, built. So that will get into this HEC-RAS will get into that CHIPS system so that any information boundary condition comes through a WIP system gets into that. So we are working on to compare either 1D model. Their model runs in like 200, 300 CPU cycles per hour. HEC-RAS in like 1 minute, it's done in a desktop system. So the idea is if they're equivalent, close, or similar, then why don't we run the HEC-RAS model, which is so close? So when the HEC-RAS is done from OHD, then we'll compare the hydrograph you saw for Irene or Isabel, and that's what we're looking at. And our counterpart is the other HEC-RAS guy you saw doing some testing. So we gave our HEC-RAS to them, they with him. So there's a collaboration, but it's not per se POC. We are like know each other, share information.
I see. Yeah, well, of course, the water level doesn't care about how NOAA is organized. That's the problem, I guess. So, you know, whether you got surge or river flow or rain or all these things, we still have to deal with it in inundation, right? So, so yeah, it gets back to Mark's original question, I guess, in terms of, you know, one of the focuses of this forum is on transitioning things to operation. So sometimes it's very clean, other times it's less so. And here's the case where, you know, I think for a variety of reasons it's not as clean, but doesn't mean the project is not important and informing what we may do or should do going forward. So Cody, so what's the future for CI Flow? I mean, is as long as DHS keeps funding it, it's going to go on, or what?
I think it'll be something that evolves as different pieces move into operations. You know, there are some research questions that Jeffy Fine and NOS regarding, you know, sort of the ideal handoff point to pass information between something like AdSearch and then a 1D model like HEC-RAS, because obviously the further downstream that boundary is, the less influential the river flow is, and so it would only need to be a one-way communication from HEC-RAS to AdSearch. But that also relies on, I guess, having the ability that if HEC-RAS doesn't go that far downstream, of being able to extend it to where it can meet an AdSearch grid. So, I lost my train of thought. Can you repeat your question so I can get my
on the future, I guess, short term?
Okay, yeah, okay. So, that's sort of one thing that, we're looking at with the HECRAS project. We have, part of that project is short-term on the scale of a graduate student, some of it is longer term. And then there are also questions that the National Hurricane Center has raised in regards to, they're very familiar with the SPLOSH model and P-Surge and all of those products, and then you could potentially be throwing in, where something like P-Surge has thousands of model runs that go into it, and then you're, trying to incorporate with that in what could end up being like a 10-member mini ensemble based on AdSurf, which has a different grid, very different physics going into it. So sort of how forecasters are supposed to digest two very different sets of data to produce a single forecast, or when are appropriate times to switch between a more SPLOSH-based forecast versus a more AdSurf-based forecast. So, it's something that could probably continue on for years. One of the long-term goals of CI Flow that we've never made the connection is to move beyond just water level and switch to something that might be more relevant to coastal ecosystems in regards to salinity and water quality and nutrient flushes. There's a whole, of course, when you get into that kind of stuff, then you need three-dimensional models. So I mean, essentially, it could go a lot of different ways. And then just because of social science efforts, here within our building, questions have been raised, about whether or not people that live along rivers, do they see themselves as being vulnerable to things like storm surge? Do they recognize that storm surge can move that far upstream, and that they are at risk even though they don't necessarily live on a traditional coast in their minds? So there are a lot of different directions that CI Flow could go over the next few years, or several years. But yeah, the AdSurf portion of the funding comes from DHS. My funding, our graduate students funding, and our social science postdoc funding, that all comes from the National Sea Grant Office. So, there's different sources of funding that would have to be sustained to keep it ongoing.
But it will. It's good for another 12 months anyway, huh?
Yeah, my understanding is that the real-time system will continue to run as long as the state of North Carolina continues to provide, because AdSurf for CI Flow is run out of a Renaissance Computing Institute in North Carolina. They receive state funding to do that, to do those model runs, and so like as long as that money remains sustained, they will continue to let it run. They wouldn't pull the plug on it unless the state did it.
Okay, well, that's fine. I just, I think I'm a little bit, we have a lot going on with our Weather Ready Nation effort in Weather Service, and a lot of it's focused on social science and better services and decision support, and it's not clear to me that we're taking advantage as much as we should of this opportunity. So I'm going to kind of follow up here to see if there couldn't be more done with regards to using this output to advance some of those goals, at least in North Carolina, because they can inform what the rest of the country does. And the stuff you've mentioned about ecosystem forecasting and all of that, that also is within the Weather Service, short to medium plans, if not, and certainly long term. So but at this moment, it's not clear to me that this is being, taken advantage of as it should be for that. So I'll see what I can do to check around anyway.
Okay, thanks.
So we're at the time. Do we have any?
Well, the conversation you were just having, Susan, I think it's Van Koopsen,
yes,
wanted to chime in and say that it's a very good question and a very good CI flow extends across offices, OAR, NOS, NWS, and no one really knows which line office needs to be lead. Does it need to be the National Weather Service since it's operational, real-time, and is decision support-centric? Does it need to be NOS, but what is their operational mission, and can they support 24/7 NWS operations? And it seems like it should be an NWS, but how does it fit into the NWS Hurricane Center's storm surge unit version of operations, and who will operate the system and information? I think that was primarily just a comment that she wanted to get out there.
Well, thank you, Susan. Yeah, those are the types of questions that I think should be addressed. So that's all?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, John, and thank you, Cody, again. Thank everyone. So remind that we coming up in April at the VLab Forum, we have Lance Rothhughes, also from Norman, who will be talking about facets, forecasting and continuum of environmental threats. So I think some of you may have already heard Lance talk about this. We're hoping to get like an update of where that stands. In May, we will have Matt Davis from the WFO La Crosse talking about the latest on IRIS. And then in September, this is a way ahead, we're going to get an update on the hazardous weather testbed activities. So thanks, everyone, and we will hopefully see you in April. Thank you.